The courtroom felt ordinary. That was the first thing people noticed, how normal everything seemed. Fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead. Lawyers shuffled papers with practiced indifference. The clerk adjusted her glasses, already anticipating another routine case that would pass without consequence. At the defense table stood a man no one looked at twice. His jacket was worn but clean, his posture calm but tired. He kept his eyes lowered, as if he understood exactly how invisible he appeared in rooms like this. Just another case. Just another name. Just another person passing through a system that rarely stopped moving. Until it did. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered with the quiet authority she carried everywhere. Measured steps, composed expression, the steady presence of someone who had spent years balancing compassion with discipline. All rise. The room stood. She sat. The clerk read the case number. Routine began. Judge Hayes opened the file, turned one page, then another. And then her hand stopped. Not dramatically, not loudly, just still. The pen paused above the paper. A small silence stretched across the room, barely noticeable at first, but long enough to feel different. She looked down again, as if confirming what she thought she had seen. Then, slowly, she looked up. Her eyes landed on the defendant, and something changed. The room didn't know why yet, but everyone felt it, because authority rarely hesitates, and when it does, people notice. Before we begin, this is one of those stories that might change how you see people forever. If you enjoy deep emotional storytelling, gently subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The judge leaned slightly forward. State your name for the record. Her voice remained calm, but softer than usual. The man lifted his head slowly. For the first time, his eyes met hers. Daniel Mercer, I said quietly. The name settled into the air. And the judge's expression changed in a way so subtle most people almost missed it. A flicker of recognition. A memory moving behind her eyes. She inhaled slowly. Then she said one word. Daniel. Not Mr. Mercer. Not defendant. Just his name. And the entire courtroom froze. No one spoke. The prosecutor blinked, confused. The defense attorney turned slightly, unsure whether she had heard correctly. Judges did not use first names. They especially did not use them with familiarity. Daniel swallowed, his posture tightening slightly. Yes, Your Honor. Her gaze lingered on him longer than protocol allowed. You were not supposed to be back here, she said quietly. The words landed heavily. The courtroom shifted from routine to something else entirely. Curiosity moved through the room like electricity. How did she know him? What history existed between them? Why did her voice carry something almost personal? 17 years earlier, another courtroom had looked different. The same judge. A younger version of her. A teenage boy standing alone, accused of something small but meaningful. A decision made that day had changed the trajectory of more than one life. And now, that past had returned. The prosecutor cleared his throat cautiously. Your Honor, shall I proceed with the charges? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained on Daniel, searching, remembering. Finally, she nodded. Yes, continue. But the tone of the room had already shifted. Routine had disappeared. Every person present sensed they were witnessing something unusual, something unfinished. Daniel Mercer is charged with unlawful entry into a restricted municipal facility, the prosecutor read. Murmurs passed quietly through the gallery. Daniel remained still. Judge Hayes listened carefully, but her focus kept returning to him. Mr. Mercer, she said after the charges were read, Why were you there? His answer came slowly. I wasn't trying to break in. A pause. I was trying to get something back. Curiosity deepened. What exactly? She asked. He hesitated, and in that hesitation lived years of history no one else in the room understood yet. Proof, he said finally. Silence, the kind that makes people lean forward without realizing it. Judge Hayes' eyes narrowed slightly. Proof of what? He looked directly at her, not defiant, not afraid, just honest. That I didn't disappear by accident. The words hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered, and somewhere beneath the calm surface of the courtroom, a story far larger than a simple case began to unfold. The silence that followed Daniel's words felt heavier than anything that had come before. Proof. The word lingered in the air like a door half opened, revealing just enough to make everyone in the room uneasy. Judge Eleanor Hayes didn't speak immediately. She simply watched him. Not like a judge evaluating a defendant, but like someone trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. The man standing before her now looked older than his years. Lines of exhaustion rested quietly around his eyes. His posture carried the weight of someone who had spent too long walking alone. But beneath that, she could still see the boy. 17 years earlier, sharp-eyed, defiant, brilliant in a way that made people uncomfortable, and completely unprepared for the system he had stepped into. The prosecutor cleared his throat again, trying to pull the room back toward normal procedure. Your Honor, the defendant entered a restricted municipal archive facility after hours. Security footage confirms unauthorized access. Judge Hayes nodded slightly. I understand. Her voice returned to its professional calm, but something beneath it remained different. She looked back at Daniel. You said you were retrieving proof. Proof of what? He hesitated again, not because he didn't know, because he wasn't sure how much to reveal. That I didn't disappear by accident, he repeated. Murmurs moved quietly through the gallery. Judge Hayes leaned back slightly. Clarify. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if preparing to carry a heavy story into the light. Years ago, I worked for the city, he said. Research department, infrastructure analysis. The prosecutor frowned slightly, flipping through his notes. I see no record of that. Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. That's the problem. Curiosity tightened around the room. Even the bailiff shifted his stance slightly, listening. Judge Hayes folded her hands. You're saying your employment records were removed? Yes. And you believe evidence of this exists inside the archive facility? Yes. The defense attorney spoke carefully. My client maintains that documents related to a major infrastructure report were altered or erased after he raised concerns. The prosecutor scoffed lightly. That's a serious allegation. Daniel didn't react. I know, he said quietly. Judge Hayes watched him closely. Years ago, she had seen the same calm certainty in him, the quiet refusal to bend even when no one else believed him. Back then, he had been accused of hacking into school servers, but the truth had been simpler. He had exposed a grading algorithm that unfairly penalized certain students. She had chosen mentorship instead of punishment. She remembered thinking he would go far, and then he vanished from her courtroom, from the system, from everything, until today. What happened after you left the mentorship program? She asked. Daniel hesitated. I got a job offer, he said. City Research Division. They said they needed people who understood patterns. And I found something. The room leaned forward without realizing it. What? She asked. A structural risk report, he said. A series of infrastructure failures waiting to happen. Bridges, utilities, systems no one was monitoring correctly. The prosecutor crossed his arms. And this relates to today, how? Daniel turned toward him calmly. Because after I submitted the report, it disappeared. Silence again. Judge Hayes felt something shift deep inside her. Authority shock. The narrative was beginning to change. You're claiming suppression? She asked. Yes. And you tried to retrieve evidence from the archive? Yes. Why now? She asked. He hesitated longer this time, because this was the part that carried the most weight. Because something happened last month, he said quietly. What happened? A bridge inspection was canceled, he said. The same bridge I flagged years ago. The words landed heavily. The courtroom felt colder. And you believe your old report could prevent harm? She asked. Yes. The prosecutor spoke again. Your Honor, regardless of his motivations, unauthorized entry remains a crime. Judge Hayes nodded slowly. Yes. Her eyes returned to Daniel. But intent matters. The tone of the room shifted again. The defense attorney noticed it immediately. This was no longer just about trespassing. This was about history, responsibility, and whether someone who had once tried to warn others had been ignored. Daniel's gaze softened slightly. He hadn't expected her to listen. Not like this. Not after so many years. You always believed people should speak up, he said quietly. The courtroom froze again. Judges were rarely addressed so personally. Judge Hayes's expression remained controlled, but something moved behind her eyes. That belief has not changed, she said. Outside, the faint sound of distant traffic drifted through the windows. Inside, time felt suspended. The prosecutor shuffled papers nervously. The defense attorney waited. Observers leaned forward, sensing that something deeper was unfolding. Judge Hayes looked down at the file again, then back at Daniel. Mr. Mercer, did anyone else know about this report? He hesitated. Yes. Who? He swallowed. The person who trained me. And who was that? He held her gaze. You. The room went completely still. The courtroom did not breathe. It felt as though the air itself had paused, suspended between past and present. You. The word lingered long after Daniel spoke it. Judge Eleanor Hayes did not react immediately. Years of discipline held her posture steady, her expression neutral, her voice silent. But everyone in the room felt the shift. The prosecutor stopped turning pages. The defense attorney stared at Daniel as if hearing him for the first time. Even the bailiff, trained to remain detached, leaned ever so slightly forward. Because this was no longer a routine proceeding. This was something else entirely. You, Daniel repeated softly. Not accusing, not emotional, just factual. Judge Hayes exhaled slowly through her nose, her gaze steady. Explain, she said. Her tone remained calm, but there was weight beneath it now. Daniel nodded once. You supervised the Mentorship Review Board, he said. You approved my placement into the city research program. Recognition moved across her face, subtle but undeniable. The memory returned like a photograph slowly developing. A conference room, stacks of applications, a young man who spoke differently than everyone else, sharp, direct, uncomfortable in the way truth often is. Yes, she said quietly. I remember recommending you. The admission landed heavily. Curiosity rippled through the courtroom. The narrative had shifted again. The judge wasn't simply recognizing a former defendant. She had helped shape his path. The prosecutor spoke carefully. Your Honor, if there is a personal connection, we may need to address potential conflict. She raised her hand gently. One moment. Her eyes remained on Daniel. "When you say I trained you, what do you mean?" He hesitated, because this part felt personal. "Not directly," he said, "but you reviewed my work, you challenged my reports, you told me patterns only matter if someone has the courage to follow them." A faint flicker moved across her face. She remembered saying that to dozens of students, but only one had taken it so seriously. "And you believe this current situation connects to that?" she asked. "Yes." "How?" Daniel swallowed slowly. "The infrastructure report I filed, the one that disappeared. You were the last person who saw it." The courtroom froze again. The prosecutor looked stunned. The defense attorney leaned forward sharply. Judge Hayes remained still, but inside, something shifted deeply. She searched her memory. The mentorship years had blurred together over time, hundreds of cases, hundreds of reports, but something about his certainty felt undeniable. "Why would I have seen it?" she asked carefully. "Because after it was rejected by my department, I submitted it to the Oversight Review Board." A pause. "And you chaired that board." The weight of the statement settled across the room like falling dust. Judge Hayes felt an old memory pressing against her thoughts. Late evenings reviewing files, reports that felt too technical, too dense, too complex for most reviewers. One of them had felt urgent. She had written notes in the margin. She had flagged concerns. But what happened after? That part remained unclear. "I reviewed many reports," she said slowly. "I know," Daniel replied. "But that one mattered." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, this line of discussion may be irrelevant to the current charges." Judge Hayes nodded slightly. "Perhaps," she paused. "But it may also explain intent." Silence followed, because intent had become the center of the case. Daniel spoke again, voice quieter now. "When the report disappeared, I assumed it was bureaucracy, delays, paperwork." He hesitated. "But then my access was revoked. My emails vanished. My badge stopped working." The defense attorney watched him carefully. "And you believe someone intentionally removed you?" she asked. "Yes." "Why?" He hesitated again. "Because I didn't stop asking questions." The room felt heavier. Judge Hayes felt a quiet unease forming, not doubt in him, but in the system she had trusted. "Why return now?" she asked. "Because the bridge I flagged failed an inspection 2 weeks ago." Gasps moved softly through the gallery. "And you believe your report contains warnings that could prevent something worse," she said. "Yes." Silence again. The kind that deepens emotion rather than breaking it. Judge Hayes looked down at the file in front of her, then back at Daniel. Years ago, she had believed in his potential. Now she faced the possibility that his warnings had been ignored, and that her own oversight role might have been part of that chain. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing quietly against her composure. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "do you have proof that the report existed?" He nodded. "That's what I went back to retrieve." Authority shock moved through the room, because suddenly the act of unlawful entry no longer felt simple. It felt like desperation, like someone trying to reclaim something lost. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Her voice softened but remained firm. "If what you're saying is true, then this case is no longer only about trespassing." The prosecutor stiffened. The defense attorney held her breath. Daniel said nothing. Because he knew. Everything was about to change. She looked at him again, and for the first time since the hearing began, something like personal recognition crossed her face openly. "Daniel," she said quietly, "tell me exactly what you found that night." and the entire courtroom leaned forward. The courtroom felt closer now, not physically, but emotionally. The distance between judge and defendant, between authority and vulnerability, had begun to narrow. Every person present sensed it, even if they couldn't explain why. Judge Eleanor Hayes leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady on Daniel Mercer. "Tell me exactly what you found that night." Her voice carried calm authority, but beneath it lived something deeper, curiosity mixed with responsibility. Daniel hesitated, not because he didn't know what to say, because saying it out loud made it real. "The archive room was different than I remembered," he began quietly. "Security had been upgraded, access logs restricted." The prosecutor crossed his arms. "That suggests proper protocol, not wrongdoing." Daniel nodded faintly. "I expected that, but when I accessed the internal storage, entire folders were missing." "What folders?" the judge asked. "The infrastructure risk reports from that year," he said. "Not just mine, multiple files." A ripple moved through the gallery. Judge Hayes's expression remained neutral, but her focus sharpened. "And you believe these were removed intentionally?" "Yes." "What makes you certain?" He hesitated. "Because one file remained." Silence deepened. "Which file?" she asked. "My report," he said. The room froze. The defense attorney leaned forward sharply. "Then why claim it disappeared?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Because it wasn't complete anymore." The words landed heavily. Judge Hayes watched him carefully. "Explain." "The sections about structural risk, gone, replaced with generic summaries. It looked like a harmless maintenance report." The prosecutor shook his head slightly. "Editing or redaction is not unusual." Daniel didn't argue. He simply continued. "But the metadata wasn't erased." Judge Hayes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Metadata?" "Timestamps," he said. "Edit history, author changes." "And what did it show?" He swallowed slowly. "That the original warnings were removed after final review." A long pause. "And the final review was authorized under your board." The room stopped breathing again. Judge Hayes remained perfectly still. Not defensive, not reactive, but deeply focused. The weight of leadership meant accepting uncomfortable information without flinching. "Are you suggesting the review board altered your report?" she asked calmly. "I don't know who did," Daniel said quietly. "Only that it happened after oversight approval." The prosecutor spoke quickly. "This is speculation." "Perhaps," she replied calmly, "but it is relevant speculation." She leaned back slightly, absorbing the implications. Years ago, she had believed in transparency within the system. Had she missed something? Had she trusted processes that were quietly manipulated after the fact? Her mind moved through memories like turning pages, late nights reviewing files, recommendations written in careful handwriting. She remembered approving risk escalation on at least one infrastructure report. Was it his? She couldn't be certain yet. "What proof did you retrieve?" she asked finally. Daniel reached into his pocket slowly, careful not to alarm the deputies. The defense attorney intervened gently. "He has a USB device recovered during arrest," she said. "Currently logged as evidence." The prosecutor nodded. "That is correct." Judge Hayes turned toward the clerk. "Bring it forward." The small device looked ordinary, almost insignificant. Yet the room watched it like it held something dangerous. The clerk placed it on the bench. Judge Hayes didn't touch it immediately. Instead, she looked back at Daniel. "Before we proceed, I need to understand your intention clearly." He nodded. "I didn't want revenge," he said quietly. "I just wanted someone to see what was erased. Silence followed. The honesty in his voice felt heavy. Not dramatic, not desperate, just tired, like someone who had been ignored too many times. The prosecutor spoke carefully. "Your Honor, regardless of motivations, unauthorized entry remains." She raised her hand. "Yes, I understand." Her gaze returned to Daniel. "And yet, intent shapes context." Authority shock moved through the room again, because the judge wasn't dismissing the law, but she wasn't ignoring humanity either. She nodded toward the clerk. "I prepare the device for secure review." The room held its breath. Everyone sensed that whatever existed inside that small piece of technology could reshape everything. The defense attorney watched Daniel closely. The prosecutor adjusted his stance. Even the gallery leaned forward unconsciously. Judge Hayes finally reached toward the device, then paused, because in that moment, something else occurred to her. "Daniel," she said quietly. "Yes? If this report was altered, why do you believe I would listen now?" He met her eyes directly. "Because you were the only person who ever told me truth mattered more than comfort." The words settled deeply, and for the first time, something like emotion moved visibly across her face. Outside the windows, clouds shifted, allowing a beam of light to cross the courtroom floor. Inside, the story moved closer to its first true turning point, because whatever lived inside that device was about to reveal more than anyone expected. The courtroom felt suspended in anticipation. The small USB device resting on the bench looked almost ordinary, a simple object surrounded by extraordinary attention. Every eye followed it, as though it carried a weight far beyond its size. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat motionless for a moment longer before finally speaking. "Proceed with secure display." The clerk nodded and handed the device to the court technician seated near the side wall. A laptop was connected to the courtroom monitor, its screen glowing faintly as files began to load. Daniel stood quietly at the defense table, watching without expression. But inside, tension moved through him like electricity. This was the moment he had worked toward for years, and the moment he feared most. Because truth did not always arrive gently. The technician cleared his throat. "There are several folders here, Your Honor." Judge Hayes nodded. "Open the one labeled Archive Recovery." The cursor moved. A folder opened. Rows of files appeared. Reports, timestamps, internal notes. The courtroom leaned forward collectively. "Select the infrastructure risk report," she said. A document appeared on the screen. At first glance, it looked harmless. Routine language, maintenance recommendations, nothing urgent. The prosecutor nodded slightly. "This appears consistent with standard municipal documentation." Daniel didn't react. He simply waited. Judge Hayes's gaze remained fixed. "Show revision history." The technician clicked another tab, and everything changed. Lines of edits appeared layered across the document. Redacted sections, rewritten paragraphs, multiple authors listed. The defense attorney leaned forward sharply. "What are those entries?" she asked. "Edit logs," the technician replied. Judge Hayes's voice lowered slightly. "Scroll to earliest version." The screen shifted. The original draft appeared, and the room fell silent. Bold, highlighted warnings filled the page, structural fatigue indicators, load stress projections, probability of failure within a defined time frame, urgent inspection recommendations. The difference between versions felt like two completely different reports. The prosecutor frowned deeply. "This is significantly different." Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is what I submitted." Judge Hayes's eyes moved across the text carefully. Her face remained composed, but inside, something shifted heavily. She remembered reviewing reports flagged as urgent. She remembered pushing for deeper analysis. But this was not what she recalled approving. "Show final modification entry," she said quietly. The technician clicked again. A new panel appeared. Last editor. Oversight review authorization. Timestamp. 2 days after board approval. Judge Hayes's fingers tightened slightly against the desk. "That authorization was under my board," she said softly. The courtroom held its breath. Authority shock moved through the space like a silent wave. Daniel spoke carefully. "I'm not saying you changed it." Her eyes lifted slowly toward him. "But someone used that authority." The prosecutor shifted uneasily. "Your Honor, internal processes are complex. This may reflect administrative adjustments." The defense attorney shook her head. "These are not minor adjustments. Entire risk projections were removed." Judge Hayes remained silent for several seconds. Her responsibility felt heavier now, not because she believed she had done wrong, but because leadership meant accepting the possibility that something had happened under her oversight without her knowledge. She leaned forward slightly. "Is there anything else?" The technician hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor." "What?" "There is an additional file embedded within the metadata." The room stiffened. "Open it." A small video file appeared. No title, no description, just a timestamp. The technician hesitated. "Play it." The screen flickered. Grainy security footage filled the monitor. A conference room. Several officials seated around a table. Daniel watched silently. Then the camera angle shifted, and Judge Hayes felt a cold realization move through her. She was in the video, younger, focused, listening. The room froze completely. No one spoke. The footage showed her reviewing documents, including the original report. Her voice filled the courtroom speakers. "These risk projections require escalation," she said in the recording. "We cannot reduce urgency without further analysis." The courtroom erupted in murmurs before the bailiff restored order. Daniel lowered his gaze. The defense attorney's eyes widened. The prosecutor stared at the screen. Because the video proved something undeniable. The judge had not approved weakening the report. She had argued for the opposite. The footage continued. Another voice spoke, unidentified. Escalation would trigger costly inspections, adjust language to reduce urgency. The room fell silent again. The recording ended abruptly. Judge Hayes sat perfectly still. The emotional weight of the moment settled deeply around her. Not relief, not anger, just clarity. Someone had altered the report after she left the process, and Daniel had been right. She exhaled slowly. "This changes the context significantly," she said calmly. The prosecutor nodded reluctantly. "Yes, it does." Daniel remained silent. He had waited years for someone to see this, and now the truth was unfolding in front of everyone. Judge Hayes looked at him again. Recognition had deepened into understanding. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "you didn't just retrieve proof." He shook his head slightly. "No, you preserved history." The words settled heavily across the room. Because suddenly the narrative had transformed. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a witness to something much larger, and the case had reached its first true emotional reversal. The courtroom did not return to normal after the video ended. It couldn't. Something fundamental had shifted. The screen faded to black, but the words spoken in the recording lingered in the air, heavy, undeniable. These risk projections require escalation. Judge Eleanor Hayes remained still behind the bench, her hands resting lightly on the wood. Years of discipline kept her expression calm, but beneath that calm lived a quiet storm of realization. The past was no longer abstract. It was visible, recorded, unavoidable. No one spoke at first. The prosecutor stared at the monitor as though replaying the moment in his mind. The defense attorney exhaled slowly, eyes moving between Daniel and the judge. Even the gallery remained silent, sensing that something larger than a single case was unfolding. Finally, Judge Hayes broke the silence. "Turn off the display." The technician nodded. The screen went dark, and with it, the room felt suddenly more intimate, as though everyone present had just witnessed something deeply personal. She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Mercer, when you retrieved this footage, did you know it included this recording?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I only knew the archive system kept embedded backups. I didn't know what would still exist." Her gaze lingered on him. "You risked arrest to recover something you had never even seen." "Yes. Why?" The question carried weight beyond curiosity. He hesitated. "Because I remembered what you said back then." "What did I say?" "That truth doesn't disappear just because people stop looking." The words landed softly but powerfully. A quiet authority shock moved through the courtroom, because now the judge herself had become part of the emotional center of the story. The prosecutor cleared his throat carefully. "Your Honor, given this new evidence, the state acknowledges that circumstances surrounding the defendant's actions require re-evaluation." The defense attorney nodded. "This fundamentally changes the interpretation of intent." Daniel remained still. He wasn't watching the attorneys. He was watching the judge, waiting. Judge Hayes sat back slowly, absorbing everything. She felt the weight of responsibility deeply now, not just as a judge, as a person whose earlier decisions had shaped the path that led Daniel here. Years ago, she had believed systems could protect truth. Now she saw how easily systems could bury it, and how long it could take for someone to bring it back into the light. She spoke again, voice calm but firm. "This court recognizes that the defendant's actions may have been motivated by preservation rather than violation." The words echoed. Authority shock. The narrative had shifted completely. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, not in relief, but in validation. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he felt seen. But Judge Hayes wasn't finished. "There is, however, a larger question now," she said. The room leaned forward collectively. "If the report was altered after oversight review, and if the warnings were removed, then this is no longer solely a criminal matter." The prosecutor nodded slowly. "It may involve administrative investigation." "It may involve public safety," she corrected gently. Silence followed, because everyone understood what she meant. The stakes had grown far beyond one case. She turned back to Daniel. "You said the bridge you flagged recently failed inspection." "Yes. And you believe the original report contains warnings that are still relevant today?" "Yes." Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Then the question becomes not only why you entered the archive, but why no one listened when you first tried to warn them." The room grew still again. Authority had shifted direction. Not against him, toward the truth. Daniel swallowed slowly. For years he had imagined this moment. Someone finally asking the right question. He had expected anger, dismissal, maybe even punishment. But not this. Not understanding. Judge Hayes folded her hands. "This court will take a brief recess." The gavel struck gently. The sound echoed louder than expected. People began to whisper immediately, tension breaking like a dam. Reporters hurried toward the hallway. The prosecutor stepped aside, already making calls. The defense attorney turned toward Daniel, eyes bright with cautious optimism. "You just changed everything," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "No." He glanced toward the empty bench where the judge had just stood. "She did." Inside her chambers, Judge Hayes closed the door slowly behind her. The silence there felt different, heavier, more reflective. She removed her glasses and sat. The video replayed in her mind. Her younger voice, her certainty, her insistence that truth mattered. And now, years later, that same truth had returned, carried back into her courtroom by the one person who refused to let it vanish. She realized something then. This was no longer just a case. It was a reckoning. Outside, the courtroom waited. And when proceedings resumed, everything would change again. When Judge Eleanor Hayes returned to the courtroom, the energy felt completely different. People stopped whispering the moment she entered. Even those who had not followed every detail of the case sensed that something significant was unfolding, something larger than procedure. She sat slowly. The room followed. "All rise. Be seated." Her voice remained calm, steady, but there was a deeper weight behind it now, the kind of weight that comes from understanding more than everyone else in the room. Daniel watched her carefully. For the first time since the hearing began, he felt unsure, not afraid, just aware that whatever happened next might reach deeper into their shared past than either of them expected. The prosecutor remained standing, posture less rigid than before. The defense attorney waited quietly, sensing that control of the narrative had shifted. Judge Hayes looked down at her notes briefly, then back at Daniel. "There is something we need to address," she said. The room stilled. "During recess, I reviewed archived oversight records." She paused. I discovered something I had not remembered until now." Curiosity tightened across the room, authority preparing to reveal something personal. That alone created tension, 17 years earlier. A young Daniel Mercer had stood in front of a review board, not as a defendant, but as a candidate. He had been intense, precise, unwilling to soften his conclusions to make others comfortable. Many reviewers had rejected him. Too difficult, too rigid, too focused on problems others preferred to ignore. Only one person had insisted he deserved a chance: Judge Hayes. She spoke carefully now. "Mr. Mercer, I did more than recommend your placement." Daniel's brow tightened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I argued for you when others wanted to remove you from the program." The room shifted. The defense attorney blinked. The prosecutor looked surprised. Daniel remained still. "I don't remember that," he said quietly. "You wouldn't," she replied gently. "Those discussions happened after you left the room." A pause. "You were considered difficult." A faint smile crossed his face. "That sounds accurate." Soft laughter moved through the courtroom, breaking tension briefly. But she wasn't finished. "I believed your work mattered," she continued, "and I believed your warnings deserved attention." Her voice softened slightly. That belief did not change. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. For years he had assumed he had been alone, that the system had simply discarded him. Now he learned someone had fought for him, and he had never known. Authority shock moved quietly through the room. The judge was no longer just a figure of law. She was part of the story. Part of the reason Daniel had ever entered the city research program. The prosecutor spoke carefully. "Your Honor, given this history, do you believe recusal may be appropriate?" The question landed heavily. Everyone waited. Judge Hayes considered it seriously. Professional boundaries mattered deeply to her, but so did fairness. "My involvement was administrative," she said finally, "not personal." I believe I can remain impartial. She looked directly at Daniel. Do you agree? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes. The room exhaled collectively. The case would continue. She leaned forward slightly. There is, however, another detail. Curiosity tightened again. During the oversight review meeting, your report caused significant disagreement. Daniel swallowed. What kind of disagreement? Financial, she said quietly. The word landed heavily. Escalating your warnings would have triggered immediate inspections, costing millions. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. So they changed the report, Daniel said softly. I don't know who, she replied carefully, but I know I opposed weakening it. The emotional weight deepened, because now the story wasn't just about lost evidence. It was about power, about cost, about decisions made quietly behind closed doors. Daniel's voice lowered. I thought everyone chose money over safety. She shook her head gently. Not everyone. Silence followed. The shared history between them deepened. Years of misunderstanding shifting slowly toward clarity. Judge Hayes turned toward the courtroom. This proceeding must now consider not only the defendant's actions, but whether his actions prevented further loss of critical information. The prosecutor nodded reluctantly. Yes, Your Honor. Authority shock again. The case had fully transformed. Daniel felt something unfamiliar rise inside him. Not relief, not victory. Something quieter. Recognition. He had not been invisible after all. Judge Hayes spoke again. Mr. Mercer, there is one question left. The room leaned forward. When you entered the archive that night, were you trying to clear your name or save someone else? He hesitated, longer than before, because the answer mattered. And when he spoke, his voice carried more weight than anything he had said yet. Both. The words settled heavily, and everyone understood. This story was no longer about past mistakes. It was about what happens when someone refuses to stop telling the truth. The word both lingered in the air long after Daniel spoke it. Judge Eleanor Hayes did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched him carefully, not as someone searching for flaws in his answer, but as someone listening for the truth beneath it. The courtroom felt heavier now, not tense, not hostile, just aware that they had crossed into something deeper than a legal proceeding. Both, she repeated quietly. Daniel nodded. I wanted proof that I wasn't wrong, he said, and I wanted someone to finally see what was hidden. His voice remained steady, but the years behind it could be felt in every word. The defense attorney watched him with new understanding. The prosecutor shifted uneasily, no longer certain where the boundaries of the case truly lay. Judge Hayes leaned back slightly. Then, we need to understand what happened after your report was altered, she said. A pause. Because something changed, not just in the system, but in your life. The room grew completely silent. Everyone sensed this was the moment the deeper truth would emerge. Daniel hesitated. For the first time since the hearing began, uncertainty crossed his face, because this part of the story had nothing to do with evidence or documents. This part was personal. You disappeared, she said softly. The words were simple, but heavy. You left your position, no forwarding information, no contact with the program. He nodded slowly. Yes. Why? A long breath, the kind that comes before reopening an old wound. Because after the report changed, I stopped being welcome. The defense attorney frowned. What do you mean? I was told to stop asking questions, he said. They reassigned me, removed my access, and people stopped answering emails. The prosecutor shifted. That could be administrative restructuring. Daniel shook his head gently. It wasn't restructuring, it was isolation. Silence followed. Judge Hayes's gaze sharpened. Did anyone threaten you? No, he said. Nothing direct, just pressure. What kind of pressure? He hesitated. Meetings that ended early, projects taken away, invitations disappearing. The room felt colder. Because everyone understood, sometimes the system doesn't push people out loudly. Sometimes it just stops opening doors. And eventually, she asked. They told me my position was redundant, he said quietly. And after that, I left. The simplicity of his answer made it heavier. Years of work erased with a single phrase. Judge Hayes felt a quiet anger move beneath her composure, not directed at him, but at the pattern emerging. She had seen it before. People who refused to soften uncomfortable truths often became inconvenient, and inconvenient people were easy to remove quietly. Where did you go? She asked. Daniel gave a faint smile. Everywhere and nowhere. The defense attorney leaned closer. You lived off the grid? I worked contract jobs, he said. Small analysis projects, nothing permanent. The prosecutor frowned. And you never attempted to legally challenge your dismissal? Daniel looked at him calmly. With what resources? The room fell silent again, because the answer needed no explanation. Judge Hayes nodded slowly. Years earlier, she had believed mentorship programs created opportunity. Now, she saw how easily opportunity could become vulnerability. You said something happened recently, she said. Yes. What? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. A maintenance alert crossed my inbox from an old contact. The courtroom leaned forward. It referenced the bridge inspection, he continued, the same structure from my original report. And that's when you returned to the archive. Yes. What made you believe the records would still exist? He paused. Because someone wanted me to find them. The words landed like a quiet explosion. The prosecutor spoke quickly. What do you mean? Daniel hesitated. There was a message attached to the alert, he said. What message? He swallowed. A single line. The room felt suspended. What did it say? Judge Hayes asked. He met her eyes. It said, they thought you disappeared. Prove them wrong. Silence. Absolute. The emotional stakes deepened instantly. Someone inside the system had reached out to him. Someone knew the truth. Someone wanted it exposed. Judge Hayes leaned forward slowly. Do you know who sent it? Daniel shook his head. No name, anonymous address. The defense attorney exhaled softly. So someone inside wanted the truth revealed. Or someone wanted to protect themselves, the prosecutor added cautiously. Both possibilities hung heavily in the air. Judge Hayes sat back, absorbing everything. The narrative had transformed again. Daniel wasn't just a former employee trying to clear his name. He had been pulled back into the story by someone still inside, someone who believed the truth mattered enough to risk exposure. She looked at him again. Recognition had evolved into something deeper now. Understanding. Mr. Mercer, she said quietly, you weren't just recovering evidence. He shook his head slowly. No. You were responding to a call. Yes. The courtroom felt different now, not like a place deciding guilt, like a place uncovering history. And everyone sensed that another revelation waited just ahead. The courtroom had become something entirely different, no longer a place of accusation, no longer a routine hearing. It felt like a room standing on the edge of revelation, every word moving the story closer to a truth that had waited years to be spoken. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat quietly, absorbing Daniel's last statement. They thought you disappeared. Prove them wrong. Someone had sent that message. Someone inside the system, and whoever it was, had changed everything. She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice calm but focused. "Did the message include any identifying details? Timestamps, formatting, anything unusual?" Daniel shook his head slowly. It looked like a system notification, like an automated alert. But it wasn't automated. "No." "How do you know?" He hesitated. "Because it referenced language only someone familiar with my situation would use." The room grew still again. Authority shock was building quietly. Someone who knew Daniel's history had guided him back to the archive, which meant someone else knew the truth had been buried. The prosecutor spoke carefully. "Your Honor, anonymous communication complicates reliability." "Yes," she replied gently, "but it does not eliminate relevance." Her eyes returned to Daniel. "When you received the message, did you feel threatened?" "No." "Guided?" "Yes." The distinction mattered. Judge Hayes turned slightly toward the clerk. "Pull system access logs for the archive facility covering the last 90 days. The clerk nodded. The prosecutor blinked. "Your Honor, are we expanding investigation scope within this proceeding?" She met his gaze calmly. "We are establishing context." Silence followed, because everyone understood that context had become the center of the case. Daniel watched her closely. He had expected skepticism, resistance, but instead, she moved carefully, not rushing, not assuming, simply following the trail. It felt familiar, like the way she had approached problems years ago, methodical, unafraid. The clerk handed over a printed sheet. Judge Hayes scanned it slowly. Her eyes paused, then returned to one entry. "Who is assigned under this credential?" she asked. The clerk leaned closer. "That appears to be administrative oversight access." "Name?" The clerk hesitated. "It belongs to a retired supervisor." The room tightened. "Which supervisor?" she asked. The clerk swallowed. "Michael Reyes." Daniel froze. The name landed heavily. Judge Hayes noticed immediately. "You recognize the name?" Daniel nodded slowly. "He was my department lead." The courtroom leaned forward. "And?" she asked. "He was the only person who openly supported the original report." Authority shock. The narrative shifted again. The hidden messenger might not be anonymous after all. "Is he still active within the system?" she asked. The clerk shook her head. "Officially retired 3 years ago." The prosecutor frowned. Then how would he access administrative credentials? A question that carried deeper implications. Daniel spoke quietly. "He warned me once," he said. "What did he say?" "The truth doesn't disappear, but sometimes it waits for the right moment." Judge Hayes felt something click into place. Someone had waited, watched, and when risk returned, when the bridge inspection was canceled, that person reached out, not to authorities, to Daniel. She leaned back slowly. "Mr. Mercer, did Mr. Reyes ever express concern that your report might be altered?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes." "What did he say?" "He told me to keep copies." "Did you?" "No," he said quietly. "I trusted the system." Silence, deep and heavy, because everyone in the room understood the meaning behind that statement. Judge Hayes closed her eyes briefly, not from emotion, from clarity. This was no longer simply a case about trespassing or altered documents. This was a chain of decisions, some made in silence, that had shaped years of consequences. She opened her eyes again. "Clerk," she said calmly, "locate contact information for Mr. Reyes." The prosecutor spoke quickly. "Your Honor, are you considering calling a new witness?" "Yes." The room felt the shift instantly, because if Michael Reyes appeared, the past would finally speak directly. Daniel felt his pulse quicken slightly. He hadn't thought about Reyes in years. The man had disappeared as quietly as Daniel himself. If he truly had sent the message, then someone else had carried the burden of truth all this time. Judge Hayes folded her hands. The court will recess briefly while arrangements are made. The gavel struck, and as people began to move again, the tension remained, because everyone sensed that the next person to enter this courtroom might change everything. The courtroom did not relax during the recess. People spoke in hushed voices as though raising their volume might disrupt something fragile that had begun to form. Reporters whispered near the doors, attorneys reviewed notes with unusual intensity, and observers leaned forward, waiting for someone who had not yet entered. Michael Reyes, a name that had shifted the emotional weight of the entire proceeding. Daniel remained seated, hands folded loosely in front of him. Outwardly calm, but inside, memories stirred that he had buried long ago. Reyes had been one of the few who listened when others didn't, the only one who had told him to keep pushing. And then, he had vanished too. All rise. Judge Eleanor Hayes returned to the bench, her presence restoring quiet instantly. Be seated. Her gaze moved briefly across the courtroom before settling on the empty chair reserved for witnesses. Has contact been established? She asked the clerk. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Reyes is present. A murmur moved through the gallery. Daniel felt his breath tighten slightly. The door opened. The man who entered walked slowly, deliberately. Older than Daniel remembered. Gray at the temples, shoulders carrying years of quiet fatigue, but his eyes remained sharp. Michael Reyes. The courtroom watched him approach the stand. Judge Hayes studied him carefully. Recognition flickered, not as personal history, but professional memory. You are Michael Reyes? She asked. Yes, Your Honor. Former department supervisor for municipal infrastructure analysis? Yes. He took the oath calmly, his voice steady. But beneath that steadiness lived something heavier, the weight of secrets carried too long. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Mr. Reyes, were you involved in oversight discussions regarding Mr. Mercer's original infrastructure risk report? Reyes glanced briefly at Daniel before answering. Yes. What was your position on the report? That it was accurate, he said simply. The room grew still. And yet the final version presented to this court shows significant alteration. Reyes nodded slowly. Yes. Authority shock began to build again. Who authorized those changes? She asked. He hesitated. The pause felt enormous. I don't know exactly who made the edits, he said carefully, but I know why they were made. Explain. Cost, he said quietly. The word landed heavily. Reyes continued. Escalating the risk level would have triggered mandatory inspections across multiple structures. That meant funding approvals, public disclosures, and potential shutdowns. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. And instead? The language was softened, urgency removed, risk downgraded. The defense attorney leaned forward. And Mr. Mercer? He refused to sign off on the revised version, Reyes said. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly. The memory felt raw even now. What happened after that? Judge Hayes asked. Reyes exhaled slowly. He became inconvenient. Silence filled the room. Not dramatic, just heavy. Judge Hayes's voice softened slightly. Did you send the anonymous message encouraging him to retrieve the archive? Reyes hesitated again, then nodded. Yes. The courtroom reacted immediately, whispers rising before the bailiff restored order. Daniel stared at him. "You?" he said quietly. Reyes met his eyes. "Yes." "Why?" "Because the bridge inspection was canceled," Reyes said, "and I realized the same pattern was happening again." Judge Hayes listened carefully. "You believed the original report could prevent harm?" "Yes." "And you trusted Mr. Mercer to retrieve it?" "Yes." Authority shock reached another level. The so-called anonymous messenger was not a stranger. He was a former insider, someone who had watched the system fail once and refused to let it happen again. Judge Hayes folded her hands. "Mr. Reyes, why not go directly to authorities?" Reyes gave a faint, tired smile. "Because systems protect themselves first." Silence, deep and uncomfortable. "But people protect people," he added softly, and he glanced toward Daniel. Daniel felt a wave of conflicting emotion, anger, gratitude, sadness. For years he had believed he had been abandoned. Now he realized someone had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Judge Hayes sat back slowly. The pieces were aligning: altered reports, financial pressure, a whistle ignored, a mentor who refused to let truth vanish, and a defendant who had risked everything to bring it back. She spoke carefully. "This court must now consider whether Mr. Mercer's actions preserved evidence essential to public safety." The prosecutor nodded reluctantly. "Yes, that appears increasingly likely." The narrative had flipped entirely. Daniel was no longer simply defending himself. He was standing at the center of something much larger. Judge Hayes looked at him again. Recognition had evolved into something deeper. Respect. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "when you entered that archive, did you believe anyone would stand beside you?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No." She nodded once. "Well," she said softly, "you were wrong." The words settled like a turning point, because for the first time in years, Daniel was not alone. The courtroom felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but heavy with expectation, like the quiet moment before a storm breaks, when everyone senses that something irreversible is about to happen. Michael Reyes remained seated at the witness stand, his presence anchoring the past firmly inside the present. Daniel stood quietly at the defense table, absorbing the realization that the narrative surrounding him had completely changed. What began as a simple charge of unlawful entry had transformed into something far larger. A story about truth, about systems, about what happens when someone refuses to stop asking questions. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat still behind the bench. She allowed the silence to settle fully. Years on the bench had taught her that the most important decisions were not made in haste. They were allowed to breathe. Her eyes moved slowly across the courtroom. The prosecutor, the defense attorney, the witness, Daniel. Each of them now part of a story none of them had anticipated. "Mr. Reyes," she said gently, "one final question." "Yes, Your Honor." "When you sent that message encouraging Mr. Mercer to retrieve the archive, did you believe he would face legal consequences?" Reyes hesitated. "Yes." "And yet you still sent it?" "Yes." "Why?" He looked toward Daniel again. "Because sometimes doing the right thing carries risk," he said quietly, and I knew he would understand that. Silence. Deep. Unavoidable. Judge Hayes nodded slowly. The room felt closer than ever to its emotional center. She turned toward the prosecutor. "Does the state wish to proceed with further argument?" The prosecutor stood, but his posture lacked its earlier certainty. "Your Honor, in light of the new evidence and testimony, the state acknowledges that the defendant's intent appears focused on preservation rather than malicious interference." A ripple moved through the courtroom. The defense attorney closed her eyes briefly. Relief mixed with disbelief. Authority shock again. The prosecution itself was shifting perspective. Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. Intent, she said quietly, is not the only factor. The room stilled. Context matters. Her gaze returned to Daniel. For years you believed your work had been erased, she said. Yes. And now it appears your actions restored information that may prevent future harm. Yes. She nodded once. The weight of decision moved quietly through her. 17 years earlier, she had chosen to believe in him. Today, she faced another moment requiring judgment, not just legal, but human. Her voice softened slightly. When you stood before me as a teenager, you told me something I have never forgotten. Daniel looked up, surprised. I did? You said systems fail when people stop caring enough to question them. A faint smile crossed his face. That sounds like something I would say. Soft laughter moved through the room, easing tension for a moment. She straightened slightly. The law exists to maintain order, she continued. But justice requires understanding the purpose behind actions. The courtroom held its breath. Everyone sensed the decision approaching. She turned toward the clerk. Please note that the court has reviewed all available evidence, including witness testimony, archival footage, and forensic analysis. Her tone carried quiet finality. Then she looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Mercer, this court finds that your actions, while technically in violation of access protocols, were undertaken with the intent to preserve critical information and protect public safety. The words echoed. Daniel felt his breath slow. The defense attorney's hand tightened around her pen. Judge Hayes continued. The charge of unlawful entry is therefore mitigated by extraordinary circumstances. Silence deepened. And this court determines that further prosecution would not serve the interests of justice. Gasps moved softly through the gallery. The prosecutor nodded slowly. Acceptance. Authority shock completed. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in triumph, in relief. Years of weight lifting quietly, but Judge Hayes was not finished. She leaned forward again. There's something else. The room stilled immediately. Mr. Mercer, your actions today did more than defend yourself. He waited. They reminded this court that truth sometimes survives only because someone refuses to let it disappear. Her voice softened. And that requires courage. Daniel swallowed slowly. Emotion pressed against his composure. He had expected judgment. He had not expected recognition. She lifted the gavel. Charges dismissed. The sound echoed through the courtroom, not loud, but final. And in that moment, everything changed. The sound of the gavel faded slowly, but its meaning lingered long after. For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom remained suspended between disbelief and understanding, as if everyone present needed a second to adjust to what had just happened. Charges dismissed. 2 words. Quiet, final. And yet, far more than a legal conclusion. Daniel Mercer stood exactly where he was, hands resting lightly against the edge of the defense table. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Relief came slowly, almost cautiously, like someone stepping into sunlight after years of shadow. His attorney touched his arm gently. It's over, she whispered. He nodded, but deep down he knew something else. Some endings didn't feel like endings. They felt like beginnings. Across the room, Michael Reyes remained seated, watching quietly. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No dramatic gestures, no speeches, just recognition. Two people who had carried the same truth in different ways, finally seeing it acknowledged. Reyes gave a small nod. Daniel returned it. That was enough. Judge Eleanor Hayes gathered her papers slowly. Her movements were deliberate, calm, but those who watched closely sensed something had shifted within her. Not her authority, not her composure, something deeper. A reminder of why she had chosen this path long ago. She paused before standing, her gaze moving briefly toward Daniel again. 17 years earlier, she had seen potential in a young man unwilling to accept easy answers. Today, she had witnessed that same stubborn integrity, weathered, tired, but unbroken. Justice, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about listening when truth returned, even if it arrived in unexpected ways. As she left the bench, the courtroom began to breathe again. Conversations rose quietly. Reporters hurried toward the doors. Attorneys exchanged thoughtful looks. But Daniel remained still a moment longer. He looked around the room slowly, not searching for applause or attention, just absorbing the reality that he was no longer invisible. The system had seen him. Finally. Outside the courthouse, evening light stretched across the pavement. The world moved normally. Cars passing, people walking, life continuing without knowing how much had changed inside that room. Daniel stepped through the doors and paused. Cool air filled his lungs. For years, he had carried the belief that speaking truth meant standing alone. Today had challenged that belief. Not everyone had turned away. Some had listened. Some had remembered. Footsteps approached behind him. He turned. Judge Hayes stood several feet away, no longer elevated by the bench, simply another person stepping out into the evening. They stood quietly for a moment. Professional distance remained, but something else existed too. Shared history. "You were right," she said softly. "About what?" he asked. "The truth matters, even when it takes years to be heard." He gave a faint smile. "You taught me that." She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "You chose to believe it." Silence settled between them again, comfortable this time. "Whatever comes next," she said, "remember that today wasn't just about proving something to the court." "What was it about?" She considered her answer. "About proving something to yourself." He thought about that and slowly nodded. They parted without ceremony. No dramatic ending. Just two people walking in different directions, carrying the quiet weight of understanding. In the weeks that followed, investigations reopened quietly. Old reports resurfaced, questions were asked, and somewhere, structures once ignored received new inspections. But Daniel stayed mostly out of sight. He returned to work, smaller projects, quieter efforts, focused on solving problems rather than fighting systems. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud. They are simply the moment when someone finally listens. And somewhere in another courtroom, another case waited. Another person misunderstood. Another story beginning silently. Because sometimes the people no one notices are the ones who change everything. And this was only one of many stories that started with silence.